Sunday morning, a Baptist church in rural Tennessee, a Methodist church in suburban Chicago, a Pentecostal church in Los Angeles, a non-denominational church in Seattle. For churches, different denominations, different regions, different theological traditions, but they're all singing the same songs. This investigation is based on documented music industry data, theological analysis, and cultural research. Oceans where feet may fail. What a beautiful name. Cornerstone, Mighty to Save, all written by Hillsong, an Australian megachurch most American Christians have never visited. Yet every Sunday, millions of Americans across thousands of churches sing Hillsong's music. The songs have been translated into dozens of languages, played billions of times on streaming platforms, sung in cathedrals and house churches by Catholics and Pentecostals, in rural communities and urban centers. Pastor Rachel leads worship at a church in Ohio. She told me, "When I plan worship sets, I don't even think about it anymore. Hillsong songs are just what we sing. They're contemporary, they're powerful, and everyone knows them. It's become the universal language of worship." One church in Sydney, Australia revolutionized what Christians sing worldwide. How did Hillsong, a single congregation, become the most influential voice in global Christian worship? What changed when worship music became an industry producing products for global consumption? And what's gained? And what's lost when millions of Christians sing the same songs written by the same sources? Today, we're investigating the worship revolution. How Hillsong transformed Christian worship from diverse denominational traditions into a globalized, standardized product. Why their music succeeded when thousands of other worship artists failed. And what this reveals about contemporary Christianity, because understanding the worship revolution means understanding how consumer culture reshaped Christian faith itself. This is bigger than music. It's about who controls what Christians believe, because what we sing shapes what we believe. Christian worship music was once radically diverse. Lutherans sang Luther's hymns. Methodists sang Wesley hymns. Baptists sang revival songs. Catholics sang mass settings. Pentecostals sang gospel choruses. Each tradition had distinct musical theology, worship philosophy, and sonic identity. You could identify a denomination by what they sang and how they sang it. But starting in the 1990s and exploding in the 2000s to 2010s, according to research tracking worship music trends, something unprecedented happened. Christian worship became globalized and standardized around a single model, contemporary worship music. And one church dominated that revolution more than any other: Hillsong Church in Sydney, Australia. Founded by Brian Houston in 1983, Hillsong grew from 45 people to over 150,000 globally by 2020. But their influence transcended their congregational size. Through Hillsong Worship, Hillsong United, and Hillsong Young and Free, three distinct music brands, they became the most influential voice in global Christian worship. According to music industry analysis, Hillsong songs dominate contemporary Christian music charts, streaming platforms, and church worship sets worldwide. Oceans has been streamed over 500 million times. What a Beautiful Name won a Grammy. Mighty to Save became one of the most sung songs in Christian history. Their annual conferences drew thousands of worship leaders learning the Hillsong sound. And their music shaped not just what Christians sang, but how they understood worship, church, and faith itself. Today, we're investigating how Hillsong revolutionized Christian worship. What made their music so universally appealing and commercially successful. How they built a worship empire that transcended denomination, geography, and tradition. And what this reveals about contemporary Christianity's relationship with consumer culture, theological depth, and corporate religion. Because the Hillsong revolution isn't just about music, it's about the industrialization of worship and the globalization of faith. To understand how Hillsong changed Christian worship, you need to know how Christian worship operated before they revolutionized it, and what cultural forces made their revolution possible. For most of Christian history, worship music was denominationally distinct and locally produced, according to historians of Christian worship. Hymns were written by theologians, pastors, and poets within specific traditions. A mighty fortress is our God. Luther, 1529, expressed Reformed theology. And can it be? Charles Wesley, 1738, reflected Methodist soteriology. Great is thy faithfulness. Thomas Chisholm, 1923, came from holiness tradition. Each hymn carried theological content shaped by its tradition's distinctives. The 20th century brought gradual change. The Jesus movement, 1960s, 70s, introduced contemporary worship choruses, simple, repetitive songs accompanied by guitars rather than organs. Artists like Maranatha, Music and Vineyard Music produced albums that churches could use, creating early worship music industry. By the 1980s-90s, praise and worship had become a recognizable genre distinct from traditional hymnody. But worship music remained relatively diverse and decentralized until the 1990s to 2000s, when several factors converged to enable Hillsong's revolution. First, globalization and technology allowed music to spread instantly across borders. Churches in America could download songs from Australia immediately. YouTube enabled global distribution of worship songs without traditional publishing gatekeepers. Streaming services like Spotify made worship music accessible to anyone, anywhere. Here's what changed everything. Worship music stopped being something churches produced locally and became something churches consumed globally. Second, the megachurch movement created demand for excellent worship that sounded professional and contemporary. Churches wanted worship that matched the production quality of secular music their members heard all week. This required resources most churches lacked: professional musicians, sound equipment, production expertise. Hillsong and similar ministries filled that gap by producing high-quality worship music churches could replicate. Third, the rise of worship leaders as specialists rather than pastors who also led worship created a professional class seeking training, resources, and community. Hillsong's annual conferences became pilgrimage sites for worship leaders learning the latest songs, techniques, and trends. Fourth, the decline of denominational identity and rise of generic evangelicalism meant churches were less committed to tradition-specific music. If you weren't distinctively Presbyterian or Methodist, why sing Presbyterian or Methodist hymns? Contemporary worship music offered interchangeable product that fit any church regardless of theological tradition. Hillsong capitalized on all these trends better than anyone. Founded in 1983 by Brian and Bobby Houston, Hillsong Church grew rapidly through contemporary worship and dynamic preaching. Their worship team began recording albums in 1988. By the 1990s, Hillsong worship albums were distributed globally, with songs like Shout to the Lord becoming international hits. In 1998, Hillsong launched Hillsong United, youth-focused brand with edgier sound, producing Oceans and other massive hits. They later added Hillsong Young and Free for even younger audiences. By 2010, according to music industry data, Hillsong had become a worship empire with multiple brands, annual conferences, global church plants, and dominant position in contemporary Christian music. They'd mastered not just writing good songs but building a machine that produced, marketed, and distributed worship music with corporate efficiency. By 2024, according to worship music research and industry analysis, Hillsong's influence on global Christian worship is unparalleled and controversial. The statistical dominance is undeniable. CCLI, Christian Copyright Licensing International, which tracks what churches sing, consistently shows Hillsong songs among the most used globally. According to CCLI's 2023 Top Songs list, Hillsong holds multiple positions in the top 25 most sung worship songs worldwide. Streaming data reveals similar dominance. Hillsong Worship, Hillsong United, and Hillsong Young and Free collectively have billions of streams across platforms. Churches across denominations have adopted Hillsong's sound. According to surveys of worship leaders, even churches not consciously choosing Hillsong music often select songs influenced by Hillsong's style, 4/4 time signature, emotional build to powerful choruses, introspective verses leading to declarative refrains. The Hillsong sound has become synonymous with contemporary worship regardless of who writes it. But beneath the commercial success are growing concerns about what this revolution has cost. The theological concerns emerged as scholars and pastors analyzed Hillsong's lyrical content. According to theological analysis of popular Hillsong songs, critics argue the theology is often shallow, focusing on emotional experience rather than doctrinal content. Lyrics emphasize feelings about God more than truths about God. Personal experience of worship often overshadows corporate confession of faith. And the songs, while emotionally powerful, lack theological depth that traditional hymnody provided. When worship becomes a product designed for mass appeal, does theology get sacrificed for marketability? The commercialization of worship through Hillsong's model raises uncomfortable questions about whether worship music has become industry rather than ministry. Hillsong songs generate significant revenue through licensing, streaming, and album sales. According to music industry analysis, successful worship songs can generate millions in royalties. This creates financial incentives that may conflict with worship's purpose, writing songs that sell rather than songs that form disciples. The standardization of worship across traditions means distinctive theological voices are disappearing. When Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Pentecostal churches all sing the same Hillsong songs, according to worship scholars, something essential is lost. Each tradition's unique understanding of God, salvation, and worship, once expressed through distinct music, gets homogenized into generic contemporary worship. The result is theological amnesia as younger Christians grow up singing emotional but theologically generic songs rather than content-rich hymnody that formed previous generations. The Hillsong scandals of 2020 to 2022 forced painful reckoning with how worship industry operates. Founding pastor Brian Houston resigned in 2022 amid allegations of inappropriate conduct with women and mishandling his father's child abuse. Carl Lentz, celebrity pastor of Hillsong NYC, was fired in 2020 for moral failures. Multiple reports emerged of toxic leadership culture, financial impropriety, and spiritual abuse within Hillsong globally. These revelations forced Christians to ask, should we keep singing songs written by and funding organizations with serious moral and leadership problems? Can we separate the music from the institution that produced it? The dependence on Hillsong and similar worship brands has left churches vulnerable. According to surveys of worship pastors, many churches struggle when they try to reduce Hillsong usage. Congregations want familiar songs regardless of concerns about the source. This reveals how deeply consumer expectations shape worship. Churches feel pressure to provide the Hillsong experience because that's what members have learned to expect worship should be. So what exactly made Hillsong's music so dominant? And was this revolution good for Christian worship or harmful to it? To understand Hillsong's success, music analysts and worship scholars point to both artistic excellence and corporate strategy that created competitive advantages other worship artists couldn't match. The musical craftsmanship is undeniably strong. Hillsong employed world-class musicians, producers, and songwriters who understood how to create emotionally powerful music. According to analysis of their compositional techniques, Hillsong mastered the anthemic worship song, starting introspective, building tension, releasing in powerful chorus designed for congregational participation. Songs like Oceans use dynamics, harmony, and lyrical imagery that create emotional impact while remaining singable for average congregations. The branding strategy treated worship music as product lines serving different market segments. Hillsong Worship targeted traditional contemporary worship audiences. Hillsong United offered edgier alternative sound for younger crowds. Hillsong Young and Free provided pop-influenced worship for teenagers. This segmentation, according to marketing analysis, allowed Hillsong to dominate multiple niches simultaneously while maintaining unified brand identity. At this point, a pattern emerges. Hillsong didn't just write worship songs. They built a worship empire using corporate strategies that made them unbeatable. The conference and training system created loyalty and distribution network for their music. Hillsong's annual Color Conference and worship leader events brought thousands to Sydney to learn their methods. Attendees returned home as ambassadors introducing Hillsong music to their churches. This created self-perpetuating cycle. Churches sent worship leaders to Hillsong conferences. Leaders brought back Hillsong songs. Churches sang Hillsong music. More leaders attended Hillsong conferences. The global church planting strategy established Hillsong presence in major cities worldwide: New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, creating local communities that champion their music. According to analysis of Hillsong's expansion, church plants functioned partly as marketing arms introducing Hillsong music to new regions. But the success reveals troubling dynamics about contemporary worship culture. The professionalization of worship means most churches can't produce quality comparable to Hillsong, creating dependency on outside resources. According to surveys of small church worship leaders, many feel inadequate because their volunteers can't replicate Hillsong's production quality. This breeds insecurity and consumerism as churches chase excellence, rather than authentic community worship. The emphasis on emotional experience over theological content reflects broader evangelical shift from doctrine to feelings. Hillsong songs, according to lyrical analysis, prioritize how worship makes us feel over what worship teaches us about God. Phrases like, "I feel you," and "you surround me" dominate rather than doctrinal statements about God's attributes or works. This forms Christians whose faith is emotionally rich but theologically shallow. Here's what researchers discovered. Hillsong's revolution succeeded because it gave Christians what consumer culture taught them to want: professional production, emotional experience, and brand recognition, not necessarily what forms mature faith. The lack of accountability in worship music industry means bad actors can profit from worship without oversight. Brian Houston's leadership failures didn't prevent Hillsong music from continuing to dominate because the music industry operates separately from church accountability structures. Artists can be morally compromised yet still profit from worship songs churches sing, creating an uncomfortable situation where Christians financially support problematic individuals and institutions. Rachel leads worship at a church in Ohio with approximately 300 members. She told me Hillsong songs form the core of their worship repertoire. "I plan worship sets every week, and I always include at least one or two Hillsong songs. They're what people know and expect. When we sing Oceans or What a Beautiful Name, the whole church engages because they've heard these songs everywhere." Rachel described feeling dependent on Hillsong. "I've tried introducing lesser-known worship songs or even writing original music. People don't connect with it the same way. They want the familiar Hillsong sound, that big emotional build, the powerful chorus. Anything else feels disappointing." For Rachel, worship planning became less about theology and more about managing consumer expectations. Rachel acknowledged concerns about Hillsong scandals, but said stopping their music isn't practical. "What would I replace Hillsong songs with? Our congregation would notice immediately and complain. I'm stuck between theological concerns and practical reality that people want what they want." David teaches theology at a seminary and has analyzed contemporary worship music extensively. He told me Hillsong's dominance concerns him theologically. "When you compare Hillsong lyrics to classic hymnody, the difference is striking. Hymns were theologically dense, teaching doctrine, telling biblical narrative, confessing faith. Hillsong songs are emotionally powerful but theologically thin." David described the impact on spiritual formation. "A generation raised singing Hillsong has strong feelings about Jesus but weak understanding of Christian doctrine. They can tell you how worship makes them feel but struggle to articulate what they believe about God's nature, salvation, or sanctification." David doesn't dismiss Hillsong's value but worries about imbalance. Emotional worship is biblical and necessary, but emotion without doctrinal content produces Christians whose faith collapses when feelings fade. We need both, and right now, Hillsong's revolution has tilted churches overwhelmingly toward emotion. Sarah is 24 and grew up attending a church where Hillsong music was primary worship diet. She told me those songs defined her understanding of Christianity. "I learned what worship was from Hillsong, the feeling of singing Oceans, that sense of surrender and God's presence. That's what faith meant to me. It was beautiful and real." Sarah described her crisis when Hillsong scandals broke. "I felt betrayed. These songs had been so meaningful, and then I learned the organization producing them had serious problems. It made me question everything." Sarah eventually realized her faith had been built more on emotional experiences created by Hillsong music than on theological foundation. I didn't actually know what I believed beyond how worship made me feel. When the feelings were complicated by Hillsong scandals, I realized I needed something deeper. Sarah now attends a church that balances contemporary worship with hymns. I still appreciate Hillsong songs musically, but I need more than emotion. I need theology that sustains faith when feelings aren't enough. James pastors a church that intentionally reduced Hillsong music after scandals emerged. He told me the decision was controversial but necessary. When Brian Houston resigned and more about Hillsong's culture came out, I couldn't ignore it. We were financially supporting an organization with serious moral and leadership problems every time we licensed their songs. James described the congregational response. Some people understood and supported the decision. Others were upset. They loved Hillsong songs and didn't want to stop singing them because of institutional failures. James worked to introduce more diverse worship music, hymns, songs from other contemporary artists, and original compositions. It was hard initially. People missed the familiarity and emotional power of Hillsong. But gradually, they've discovered there's more to worship than one organization's music. James believes the Hillsong revolution, while producing some good music, created unhealthy dependence. Churches should have diverse worship diet from multiple sources, not dominated by one brand. We need theological breadth, historical depth, and freedom from consumer expectations that one organization should define our worship. The moment that forced global reckoning with Hillsong's dominance of Christian worship came in 2020 to 2022 when cascading scandals revealed institutional dysfunction beneath the polished exterior. Carl Lentz's firing from Hillsong NYC in November 2020 for moral failures was the first crack in the facade. Media coverage revealed toxic celebrity culture and lack of accountability in Hillsong's governance. Brian Houston's resignation in March 2022, amid allegations of inappropriate conduct and mishandling abuse cases, represented institutional crisis at the highest level. Multiple reports emerged from former Hillsong staff and members describing spiritual abuse, financial impropriety, and leadership culture prioritizing image over integrity. These revelations force Christians globally to confront uncomfortable questions about continuing to sing songs funding and validating an organization with serious problems. The scandal made visible what had been structurally true but largely ignored. Worship music had become industry with same vulnerabilities to corruption, abuse, and greed as any corporate entity. The emotional power of Hillsong's music had obscured the commercial machinery producing it. The turning point wasn't that Christians stopped singing Hillsong. Many churches continued because congregational attachment to songs outweighed leadership concerns. But the scandals shattered illusion that worship music industry operates differently than secular music industry. Hillsong's fall revealed that when worship becomes product generating significant revenue and building celebrity brands, it creates same corrupting dynamics as any commercial enterprise. This forced overdue conversation about whether industrialized worship serves Christian formation or undermines it. The Hillsong revolution and subsequent crisis, according to worship scholars and church analysts, reveal patterns that will shape Christian worship's future. First, the dominance of single worship brands will likely decline as churches diversify sources. Post-scandal, according to surveys of worship leaders, many churches are intentionally reducing dependence on any one artist or organization. This could create healthier worship ecology with multiple voices rather than monoculture. If one church in Australia shouldn't define what billions of Christians sing, who should? And how do we build worship that's both excellent and accountable? Second, the tension between worship as ministry and worship as industry will intensify as commercial success and spiritual formation's goals increasingly conflict. Churches will face decisions about whether prioritizing excellent worship, meaning professional, polished, contemporary, serves discipleship or just caters to consumer expectations. Third, renewed interest in hymnody and historical worship may emerge as reaction against Hillsong's emotional but theologically thin model. Some churches, according to worship trends, are recovering hymns and liturgy seeking theological depth contemporary worship lacks. Fourth, the decentralization of worship music production through technology may reduce megabrands' dominance. Independent artists can now produce and distribute worship music without major labels or church backing, potentially creating more diverse worship landscape. Finally, the question of whether worship music should generate significant profit will remain contested. Some argue worship is ministry that shouldn't enrich artists or organizations. Others defend worship artists' right to profit from their work. This tension will shape worship music's business models going forward. The worship revolution that Hillsong led changed what Christians sing, and in changing what we sing, it changed what we believe. Because worship isn't just music. It's theology set to melody. It's doctrine we absorb through repetition. What we sing shapes how we understand God, ourselves, and faith itself. And when one organization dominates what billions of Christians sing globally, that organization shapes global Christianity in profound ways. Hillsong's revolution succeeded because they understood contemporary culture better than traditional worship leaders. They knew modern Christians wanted emotional experience, professional production, and contemporary sound. They delivered all three with remarkable consistency and quality. They made worship feel powerful, relevant, and engaging in ways traditional hymnody couldn't match for generations raised on pop music. But in succeeding commercially, they revealed uncomfortable truth. Worship can be commodified, packaged, and sold just like any product. And when worship becomes industry, it adopts industry's values: profitability, growth, brand dominance, celebrity culture, that may conflict with worship's spiritual purposes. The question isn't whether Hillsong wrote good songs. Many were musically excellent and spiritually meaningful. The question is whether industrialized worship can sustain Christian faith long-term, or whether it forms consumers rather than disciples. What's lost when worship becomes standardized product consumed globally? The theological distinctives that different traditions expressed through their unique music. The local creativity as churches wrote their own songs reflecting their community's experiences. The doctrinal depth that hymns provided through theologically rich lyrics. The accountability that existed when worship was embedded in church structures rather than commercial enterprises. And perhaps most importantly, the understanding that worship's purpose isn't creating emotional experiences but forming people who can worship faithfully when they feel nothing at all. The path forward requires recovering what the worship revolution neglected while retaining what it did well. Yes to musical excellence and contemporary relevance, but not at expense of theological depth. Yes to emotional engagement, but balanced with doctrinal content that forms minds, not just stirs hearts. Yes to learning from global worship, but not letting one source dominate to exclusion of diverse voices. Yes to professional quality, but remembering that authenticity and community often matter more than polish. And critically, yes to paying worship artists fairly, but no to worship music industry that prioritizes profit over formation and enables dysfunction through lack of accountability. Whether churches will make these changes remains uncertain. Hillsong's dominance continues despite scandals because congregations want familiar songs, regardless of institutional problems producing them. Consumer expectations, once established, are hard to change. And the worship industry Hillsong helped create has momentum that won't easily shift toward healthier models. But the scandals exposed what many had ignored. When worship becomes big business, it faces big business problems: greed, corruption, abuse of power, lack of accountability. The question is whether Christians care enough about worship's integrity to demand better. Worship should form us into Christ's image, not into consumers of religious products. The revolution Hillsong led gave us powerful music, but it also gave us worship shaped more by industry than by theology. We can do better. We must do better. The worship revolution changed what Christians sing. Now Christians must decide what that revolution cost, and whether what we gained was worth what we lost. Because worship is too important to leave to market forces and commercial interests. It's how we encounter God, confess faith, and form communities. It deserves better than being treated as just another product in Christian retail marketplace. Hillsong showed us worship can be powerful, contemporary, and globally unifying. Now we need to show that worship can be all those things while remaining theologically rich, institutionally accountable, and oriented toward discipleship rather than consumption.